Laura stepped into her new apartment with a sense of cautious excitement. The rooms were spacious, filled with late afternoon light that softened the walls' slight peeling and chipped corners. She'd always wanted a place of her own, a quiet spot to work and unwind, away from the chaos of the city. This apartment, nestled in a neighborhood that seemed oddly forgotten by time, felt like the perfect escape. There was something timeless about the building, with its creaky wooden floors and arched doorways. It was old, perhaps even historic, and Laura felt as if she'd stepped into a place with layers of stories hidden beneath its surfaces. As she unpacked, moving through the apartment, her attention kept drifting to the door at the end of the hallway. Unlike the others, it was oddly plain and unremarkable, painted in a shade slightly different from the rest. When the realtor had shown her the apartment, she hadn't given it much thought. The door led to a small room, empty and unadorned, with a single, high window that allowed a narrow sliver of light to enter. There was nothing unusual about it. No furniture, no decorations. It was simply there. The realtor had mentioned it offhandedly as a storage space or perhaps a spare room, but Laura felt an odd sense of reluctance to even open the door. The first evening in her new home was filled with the expected sounds of settling. The refrigerator hummed softly, the pipes rattled occasionally, and the floorboards seemed to sigh under her steps. By the time she was ready to sleep, Laura was exhausted, her body aching from the hours of moving boxes and arranging furniture. She fell into bed, comforted by the familiar weight of her blankets and the quietness of her surroundings. The room was dark, save for a faint glow from the street lamp outside her window. As she lay there, she felt her mind drifting, half aware, slipping into a light, early sleep. Then, somewhere in the distance, she heard it, a soft, subtle sound like a creak or a low groan. It wasn't uncommon for older buildings to make noise, and she brushed it off at first. But then the sound came again, clearer this time, like the faint, deliberate creaking of a door. Laura opened her eyes, staring up at the ceiling as the noise continued, slow and rhythmic, a repetitive groan that seemed to come from the hallway. She sat up in bed, straining to listen. For a moment, there was only silence. But just as she was about to relax, the creaking returned, louder, closer. Her mind raced with possible explanations. Perhaps it was a neighbor, someone passing through the hallway. Or maybe the noise was simply the old building settling in the coolness of the night. But she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that it was coming from inside her apartment. Slowly, she swung her feet out of bed and padded toward the door, her hand resting on the cold metal of the knob. She took a deep breath and opened the door, stepping out into the dim hallway. The air felt colder here, the faint scent of dust mingling with something else she couldn't quite identify, an earthy, stale odor that seemed to cling to the walls. Laura's gaze drifted toward the end of the hallway, where the door to the empty room stood slightly ajar. She was certain she'd closed it earlier. She distinctly remembered the soft click as she pushed it shut. Now, though, it was open just a crack, a thin line of darkness spilling into the hallway. She felt a chill run down her spine as she approached, her steps cautious, her hand reaching out to push the door open wider. It creaked softly as it swung inward, revealing the small, empty space beyond. The room was just as she remembered it, bare, with a pale, dust-streaked floor and that one small window near the ceiling. The shadows gathered thickly in the corners, making the space feel smaller, almost claustrophobic. Laura stood in the doorway for a moment, her eyes scanning the walls, the floor, searching for any sign of movement, anything that might explain the strange noises. But there was nothing. Just silence and the faintest whisper of cold air brushing past her skin. After a few moments, she pulled the door shut, pressing firmly until she heard the latch click into place. She lingered there, her hand resting on the doorknob, a nagging feeling pulling at her mind. Something about the room didn't sit right with her. It wasn't fear, exactly, more a sense of unease, like an itch she couldn't scratch. She told herself it was just the unfamiliarity, the strangeness of being in a new place. She was tired, and everything felt heightened in the quiet darkness of the apartment. But as she walked back to her bedroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off. The creaking didn't return that night, but Laura found herself lying awake, her mind replaying the sound over and over, each creak resonating in her memory. The morning light did little to ease the unease Laura felt from the night before. She shook off the feeling, convincing herself that it was nothing more than her imagination reacting to the strangeness of a new place. After all, she'd been exhausted, and it wasn't unusual to misinterpret small noises in the quiet of night. Yet, as she sipped her coffee and glanced down the hallway, her gaze inevitably fell on the closed door to the empty room. In daylight, it looked harmless, almost ordinary. She reminded herself there was no reason to dwell on it. Days passed, and she fell into a steady routine, working from her makeshift office in the living room and spending evenings reading or exploring the neighborhood. The old building sounds became familiar. The hum of the radiator, the clinks and clatters of plumbing in the walls, and the soft groans of the floorboards as they settled. But no matter how accustomed she became to these sounds, the door at the end of the hall continued to draw her attention. She began checking it each night, ensuring it was closed firmly, sometimes even turning the knob to reassure herself that it was latched. Then one night, as she was brushing her teeth, she heard it again, the unmistakable, slow creak of a door opening. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound was faint but distinct, coming from down the hall. She shut off the faucet, straining to listen in the silence that followed. A soft shiver ran down her spine as she heard the sound again, and she realized it was unmistakably the door to the empty room. She stepped out of the bathroom, her footsteps quiet as she crept toward the hall. Her eyes were fixed on the door, which was now open a few inches, just wide enough to expose a strip of darkness. She swallowed hard, feeling a mixture of fear and irritation. Surely it was just a draft, some issue with the old hinges. Maybe the door frame was slightly misaligned, and it didn't stay closed. But as she stared at that sliver of darkness, her instincts whispered that something was wrong, something beyond her rational explanations. Determined to put her mind at ease, Laura approached the door, her hand reaching out slowly to grasp the cold metal knob. She hesitated, listening for any other sounds, but there was only silence. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door shut once again, feeling the latch click firmly into place. She stood there for a moment, her hand lingering on the knob as if waiting for something to happen, but all remained quiet. She turned and walked back to her room, determined to ignore it, but as she reached her bedroom doorway, she heard it again, a soft, almost hesitant creak, as if the door had begun to open behind her. She spun around, her eyes widening as she saw the door inching open, just enough to reveal that same strip of darkness. Her breath caught in her throat, and she felt an overwhelming urge to run, to leave the apartment altogether. But she forced herself to stay calm, gripping the edges of her nightgown to steady her hands. Laura approached the door once more, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain anyone nearby would hear it. She closed the door again, this time leaning her weight against it to ensure it wouldn't budge. She stood there, waiting, counting her breaths until she was certain it would stay closed. Satisfied, she backed away slowly, her eyes never leaving the door. She returned to bed, pulling the covers around her tightly, as if they could shield her from whatever was happening in the hallway. But sleep didn't come easily. Her mind kept replaying the creak of the door, the way it had opened on its own, as if something unseen had been standing on the other side, waiting for her to leave it alone. Laura woke up feeling a strange heaviness, as though she'd barely slept at all. The unsettling events of the previous night lingered in her mind, filling her with a constant, low hum of dread that refused to fade with the morning light. She tried to go about her day as usual, focusing on her work, but every now and then she found herself glancing toward the hallway, half expecting to see the door open once again. It was just a door, she kept reminding herself. There was nothing unusual or threatening about an empty room. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. That evening, she tried to unwind with a book, hoping to distract herself. The building had quieted as night settled in, and the familiar sounds, creaks, hums, distant voices, became part of the stillness. But as she read, She heard something new, something that didn't belong in the quiet rhythm of the apartment. A faint whisper, barely audible, yet unmistakable. She paused, lowering her book, straining her ears to catch the sound again. There it was, coming from the direction of the empty room. It wasn't loud, just a soft, breathy murmur, like someone speaking in a hushed tone from the other side of a wall. She couldn't make out any words, only the cadence of a voice, a slow, repetitive rhythm, as if someone were chanting or muttering something under their breath. Her heart thudded as she sat frozen, trying to convince herself that it was just a trick of her imagination. But the whispers continued, steady and persistent, filling the silence with an eerie sense of presence. Laura felt a chill creep up her spine. She stood, hesitant, her feet refusing to move toward the hallway, yet her curiosity drawing her forward. She edged closer to the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last, her breath shallow as she listened intently. The whispering grew clearer as she approached the door, though the words remained just out of reach, as if they were meant only for her to sense, not understand. She stopped a few feet from the door, unwilling to get any closer. The whispers continued, an unintelligible murmur that seemed to swirl in the air around her. She clenched her fists, trying to calm the tremor in her hands, but the sound was relentless, filling her mind with a rising sense of panic. She took a step back, nearly stumbling, her instinct to flee overpowering her curiosity. Yet something in her mind insisted that she needed to confront whatever was happening, to end this creeping unease that had taken over her home. "Hello," she called out, her voice sounding weak, almost fragile in the heavy silence. The whispers stopped instantly, leaving an unnatural stillness that felt even more disturbing. She held her breath, waiting, half expecting some response. But there was only silence. Laura's hands shook as she reached for her phone, more as a comfort than with any clear purpose. She considered calling a friend, telling someone about what was happening, but she felt foolish. What could she say? That she was being haunted by a whisper? That a door kept opening on its own? Even to her, it sounded absurd, like something from a bad horror movie. She glanced down at her phone screen, the dim light casting a soft glow on her hands, grounding her momentarily. Trying to gather her courage, she approached the door again, this time leaning in, her ear just inches away from the wood. She waited, her heartbeat loud in her ears, hoping to hear something that would explain the strange sounds. But there was only silence, thick, suffocating silence that pressed against her eardrums. As she pulled away, a faint whisper returned, softer than before, but unmistakable. This time it was clearer, almost like her own name, Laura. The sound was so subtle, yet so deliberate, that she felt it resonate through her, freezing her in place. She stumbled backward, unable to shake the feeling that someone, or something, was on the other side of that door, waiting for her, calling to her. She hurried back to her bedroom, shutting the door firmly and turning the lock. She sat on the edge of her bed, her mind racing, every fiber of her being on edge. As she sat there, clutching the blanket tightly, she realized that whatever this was, it wasn't her imagination. There was something in that room, something that seemed to know her, something that had found a way to reach out to her, through whispers in the dark. Sleep eluded her, and when she finally drifted off in the early hours of the morning, it was filled with uneasy dreams, shadowed figures, soft murmurs, and the constant, oppressive presence of that door waiting for her. Days passed, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. Laura tried to ignore it, going about her routine and convincing herself that it was all just her mind playing tricks. Yet every night, as darkness settled over the apartment, she felt that creeping dread returning. The soft creaks and whispers seemed to come alive in the silence, filling her with a gnawing sense of being watched. She caught herself glancing at the empty room's door more frequently, her eyes drawn to it, waiting, as if expecting it to open again on its own. One evening, after an exhausting day at work, Laura decided she couldn't keep running from it. She needed to confront whatever was haunting her, or at least prove to herself that there was nothing in that room but dust and shadows. She grabbed a flashlight and stood in front of the door, her heart pounding as she hesitated. The air around her felt thick, almost tangible, as if the room itself were waiting for her to enter. With a deep breath, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, casting eerie shadows along the walls. The room looked exactly as it always had, empty, bare, with that single small window near the ceiling. But the air felt different, heavier, as though it carried a hidden weight. She shone the light around, inspecting every corner, even crouching to look beneath the floorboards near the walls. There was nothing, no sign of anything unusual. Relief washed over her, though it was tinged with lingering unease. She stepped back toward the door, ready to leave, when she felt a cold breeze brush against her neck. Her breath caught, and she froze, shining the flashlight behind her. The room was still empty, but the air had a distinct chill that hadn't been there before. It was as if a presence had settled in the room, silent yet overpowering. She tried to shake it off, convincing herself it was just her nerves. But deep down, she knew that something had changed. As she stepped into the hallway, the door behind her swung shut with a loud, decisive thud. She jumped, spinning around to face it, her heart racing. The door was closed, and for a moment, she wondered if it was just the draft from the open window in the living room. But as she reached for the knob, a sudden, intense feeling of dread washed over her. Her hand hovered just inches away, and she felt a faint resistance, like a barrier between her and the door. She took a step back, her pulse pounding as she realized she couldn't bring herself to touch it. It was as if an invisible force was pushing her away, repelling her from whatever lay beyond. Shivering, she retreated to her bedroom, trying to make sense of the strange sensation. She sat on the edge of her bed, her mind racing with questions. Was it all in her head? Or was something in that room actively trying to keep her out? That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak, every whisper seemed amplified, filling her mind with images of shadows moving in the darkness, of unseen hands reaching out from behind the door. She lay in bed, her eyes fixed on the faint light from the hallway, waiting for any sign that the door might open again. But it remained closed, silent, as though whatever presence she had felt had retreated back into the shadows. Just as she was beginning to relax, a faint tapping sound reached her ears. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, more insistent, like someone knocking from the inside of the door. She sat up, straining to listen, her body tense with fear. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate, each knock sending a shiver down her spine. She tried to convince herself that it was the pipes or perhaps some animal scurrying through the walls, but the sound was too precise, too intentional to ignore. Summoning every ounce of courage, she crept toward the hallway once more, her steps slow and careful. The tapping stopped the moment she stepped out of her bedroom, replaced by an oppressive silence that filled the apartment. She stared at the door to the empty room, half expecting it to burst open, but it remained closed, its surface smooth and undisturbed. The feeling of dread returned, stronger than ever, a heavy weight pressing down on her chest. Unable to bear it any longer, she whispered aloud, "Is someone there?" Her voice sounded foreign, small and uncertain in the stillness. There was no response, only the faint hum of the apartment settling around her. She felt foolish, talking to an empty room, but the silence weighed on her, thick and stifling. Just as she turned to leave, a soft, almost mocking whisper drifted from the direction of the door. It was barely audible, a single word that sent a chill through her entire body. "Stay." The voice was unlike anything she had heard before, low, cold, and filled with a quiet menace that left no room for doubt. She stumbled backward, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the realization washed over her. Whatever was in that room wasn't just an echo or a trick of her mind. It was something real, something that wanted her to know it was there, waiting. Laura fled back to her bedroom, slamming the door and locking it as if that simple act could keep the presence at bay. She sat in the corner, clutching a pillow, her mind racing with terror and confusion. She couldn't deny it any longer. The empty room was no longer just an empty space. It had become something else entirely, something that seemed to have awakened, something that wanted her to stay. Laura's days were haunted by sleepless nights and the relentless memories of the whispers, the tapping, and that single, chilling word, stay. She felt like a stranger in her own apartment, a captive within walls that seemed to close in around her. The feeling of being watched, of a presence lurking just out of sight, clung to her every movement. She couldn't escape it, not even in the light of day. Desperate for answers, she decided to speak with her neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Harrison, whom she had met briefly in the lobby a few weeks before. Laura hoped that Mrs. Harrison might know something, anything, about the history of the building or perhaps the strange occurrences in her apartment. The next morning, she gathered her courage and knocked on Mrs. Harrison's door. After a few moments, the door opened, and the elderly woman appeared, her face lighting up with a gentle smile. "Good morning, dear." Mrs. Harrison greeted her warmly. "How are you settling in?" Laura hesitated, uncertain how to begin. She took a deep breath, forcing a smile. "I wanted to ask you a few questions about the building. I've noticed some strange things happening in my apartment, and I thought maybe you might know something." The older woman's smile faded slightly, her eyes narrowing with a hint of concern. She stepped aside, gesturing for Laura to come in. Once they were seated, Mrs. Harrison seemed to weigh her words carefully, as if deciding how much to reveal. "You're in apartment 4B, aren't you?" she asked softly. When Laura nodded, Mrs. Harrison sighed, her expression tinged with something close to pity. "I suppose you deserve to know." She explained that the building had been standing for nearly a century, its walls witnessing countless lives and secrets. Decades ago, there had been a young woman who lived in Laura's apartment, a quiet, reclusive artist named Evelyn who had moved in with the hope of finding inspiration in the city. According to Mrs. Harrison, Evelyn had a troubled past, though few knew the full extent of it. She spent most of her days painting in the small, empty room at the end of the hall, rarely interacting with others. One evening, Evelyn vanished without a trace. Her belongings remained untouched, her paintings abandoned in the room, and no one knew where she had gone. There were rumors, of course. Some believed she'd taken her own life, others that she'd simply run away. But a sense of mystery and unease had hung over the apartment ever since. Neighbors reported strange sounds, whispers, footsteps, the creak of doors opening on their own, all centered around that small, empty room. The stories faded over time, dismissed as urban legends or the overactive imaginations of those who knew of Evelyn's troubled life. Laura listened, her skin prickling with a mixture of fear and intrigue. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to come together, but they painted a picture she didn't want to see. The feeling of dread, the whispers, the inexplicable cold in that room. It all aligned with Mrs. Harrison's tale. "Do you believe it?" Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Harrison's gaze turned somber. "I've lived here long enough to know that some things in this building are unexplainable. I don't know what happened to Evelyn, but I do know that every tenant who's lived in your apartment has experienced something strange. It's as if she left a part of herself behind, trapped in that room." A cold chill washed over Laura, and she gripped her hands tightly in her lap to keep them from trembling. She didn't want to believe in ghosts or spirits or curses, but she couldn't deny the strange occurrences that had plagued her since moving in. She thanked Mrs. Harrison for her time and returned to her apartment, feeling a renewed sense of foreboding as she passed the door to the empty room. It was just a door, she reminded herself, but now it felt like a boundary between her world and something far darker. That night, Laura sat alone in her living room, the quiet ticking of the clock her only company. Her mind swirled with thoughts of Evelyn, of the stories Mrs. Harrison had shared. She wondered if Evelyn's spirit was truly trapped there, if the empty room held some echo of her despair, her final moments. She considered leaving, packing up, and abandoning the apartment altogether, but something rooted her to the spot. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps it was the lingering pull of the room itself, whispering to her, calling her to stay. As midnight approached, the apartment grew colder, an unnatural chill that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Laura's skin prickled, and she found herself drawn once again to the empty room. She stood in the hallway, staring at the door, her pulse racing as she reached out, her hand hovering inches from the doorknob. She wanted to see it, to confront whatever was lurking in that room. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to put it to rest. The door opened with a creak, revealing the same empty space she'd seen countless times before. But this time, the air felt heavy, oppressive, filled with a tension she couldn't ignore. She took a step inside, feeling the cold envelop her like a shroud. The silence was absolute, pressing down on her, amplifying the rapid beat of her heart. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she scanned the room, searching for any sign of Evelyn's presence. Then she felt it, a faint, almost imperceptible pressure on her shoulder, like a hand resting there. Light as a feather, yet undeniably real. She froze, her body rigid with fear, but the sensation didn't fade. It lingered, a reminder of something lost, something forgotten. And in that moment, she felt a wave of sorrow wash over her, a sadness that didn't belong to her, yet filled her entirely. A soft whisper brushed against her ear, barely audible but unmistakable. "Help me?" Laura's eyes filled with tears, and she felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to escape the suffocating weight of that plea. But as she backed away, the whisper repeated, more insistent this time, desperate. "Help me?" She stumbled out of the room, slamming the door shut, her heart racing as she pressed her back against the cold wood. The silence returned, but the whisper lingered in her mind, haunting her, filling her with a sense of responsibility she couldn't shake. She knew now that Evelyn was still there, trapped within the walls of that empty room, waiting for someone to help her find peace. After that night, Laura's fear became unmanageable. Every corner of the apartment felt tainted, haunted by Evelyn's unseen presence. The whispering, the tapping, the cold touch on her shoulder. It was all too much. She began feeling trapped, unable to find comfort or escape in the walls that had once seemed like a peaceful retreat. She decided she couldn't stay here any longer. She needed to leave, to abandon whatever was reaching out to her from that room. The next morning, she called her friend Kate, barely able to keep the tremor out of her voice as she explained her situation. She kept her words vague, mentioning strange noises and an uneasy feeling rather than the full truth. How could she explain the whispers and touches without sounding insane? Kate listened patiently and agreed to let Laura stay with her for a while, a temporary reprieve from the growing terror in her own home. Laura packed a bag with trembling hands, her body tense with every step, half expecting to feel that cold pressure on her shoulder or to hear Evelyn's desperate plea again. The air felt dense, heavy with an almost tangible resistance, as though the apartment itself didn't want her to leave. She forced herself to ignore the feeling, to push through the invisible weight pressing down on her, determined to reach the front door. As she reached for the doorknob, a wave of cold air washed over her, bringing with it a faint whisper that echoed in her mind. "Don't go." The voice was filled with a quiet desperation, an intense need that made her freeze in place. She clenched her jaw, fighting against the surge of pity that flooded her chest. But she couldn't afford to feel sympathy. She needed to escape, to find peace somewhere far from this haunted apartment. She yanked the door open, stepping out into the hallway with a sense of relief that was almost dizzying. She hurried down the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. She didn't dare look back, afraid that she might see something lurking in the shadows, watching her leave. She kept her gaze fixed ahead, focusing on the sunlight streaming through the building's front entrance, the promise of freedom just steps away. The air outside was a balm to her senses, refreshing and warm, a stark contrast to the stifling cold that had permeated her apartment. She took a deep breath, feeling the tension begin to melt away. She headed straight to Kate's apartment, hoping that a few nights away would be enough to calm her nerves, to make her forget the haunting whispers and the sense of being watched. But as the day turned to evening, Laura found herself growing uneasy once again. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with her, lingering in the back of her mind, like a shadow that wouldn't fade. She told herself it was just paranoia, a reaction to the stress she'd been under. But deep down, she knew it was something more. She could almost hear the faint echo of Evelyn's voice, a whisper of sadness that clung to her. refusing to let go. As she lay in bed that night, the silence felt oppressive, suffocating. She tried to close her eyes, to block out the memories, but sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the apartment, every shifting shadow seemed to remind her of the empty room. She tossed and turned, her mind racing with images of Evelyn, of the cold touch on her shoulder, of the desperate plea that had haunted her dreams. The following morning, she tried to ignore her growing anxiety, distracting herself with work and conversation. But the feeling of being watched, of something unseen lurking just out of reach, wouldn't leave her. By midday, she felt so unnerved that she considered returning to her apartment, if only to confront whatever was tethering her to that place. She needed answers, a way to put the past to rest once and for all. Reluctantly, she made her way back to the apartment, her steps slow and hesitant as she climbed the stairs. She felt a strange pull, a compulsion that urged her forward, though every fiber of her being screamed to turn around. When she reached her door, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She didn't want to go inside, but the need for closure was stronger than her fear. As she stepped into the apartment, the familiar coldness washed over her, seeping into her bones. The air felt thick with an almost palpable sorrow, a weight that seemed to press down on her, filling her with an overwhelming sense of sadness. She knew, without a doubt, that Evelyn's spirit was still there, lingering in the shadows, bound to that empty room. Laura made her way down the hallway, her footsteps slow and deliberate, her gaze fixed on the door at the end. She reached out, her hand trembling as she turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room looked as it always had, empty, silent, yet filled with a presence that seemed to watch her, waiting. She stood in the doorway, her heart pounding, a mixture of fear and pity swirling in her chest. She didn't know what to say, what to do. She only knew that she couldn't leave Evelyn behind, not without trying to help her find peace. She took a deep breath, her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke into the silence. "Evelyn, if you're here, I want to help you. I don't know how, but I'll try." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then a soft, almost imperceptible warmth filled the room, as though the air had lightened, the cold receding ever so slightly. Laura felt a gentle pressure on her shoulder, a touch that was warm this time, comforting. She closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek as she sensed Evelyn's presence, her spirit reaching out in gratitude, a silent acknowledgement of her offer. When she opened her eyes, the room seemed brighter, less oppressive, as if a weight had been lifted. She knew there was still more to be done, that Evelyn's spirit wasn't fully at rest yet. But for the first time since she'd moved in, Laura felt a glimmer of hope. She had found a way to connect, to communicate, and maybe, just maybe, to help Evelyn find the peace she'd been denied for so long. Over the next few days, Laura felt an unexpected calm settle over her. The air in the apartment felt lighter, as though a veil had lifted. The unsettling cold that once permeated the place had faded, replaced by a quiet stillness. It was almost peaceful. She hadn't heard any whispers or felt any touches, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Evelyn's presence still lingered, waiting for something. Laura felt compelled to understand Evelyn's story more deeply, certain that it held the key to helping her find peace. She decided to dive into the building's history, searching for any record of Evelyn and her life. Laura spent hours at the local library, combing through old newspapers and records. She was looking for something, anything that might explain Evelyn's haunting, some clue as to what had tied her spirit to the apartment. As she sifted through faded articles, one headline finally caught her eye: "Young woman disappears mysteriously from apartment building." Her heart skipped as she realized the date matched the time Evelyn would have lived there. The article described how Evelyn had been reported missing after failing to show up for an art exhibit she had been preparing for months. Friends and neighbors had grown concerned, and eventually, the police had broken into her apartment, finding it exactly as Laura had found it: quiet, empty, untouched. The police had ruled it as a likely disappearance due to personal issues, but neighbors had whispered rumors of foul play. According to the article, some believed Evelyn had been having troubles with a man who had become obsessed with her, though no evidence had ever surfaced. Her disappearance remained a mystery, unsolved and forgotten by time. Laura felt a chill run down her spine. She could imagine the fear Evelyn must have felt, the loneliness and isolation of being trapped in that apartment, unable to escape from someone who had likely driven her to vanish. The knowledge filled her with sorrow, a sympathy that felt almost unbearable. If Evelyn had been haunted by someone in life, perhaps her spirit was doomed to relive that torment, bound to the place she had last known, unable to find peace. Laura returned to the apartment with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew now that Evelyn's spirit was waiting for closure, for some acknowledgement of the pain she had endured. That evening, as the sky grew dark and shadows filled the rooms, Laura made her way to the empty room once more. She could feel Evelyn's presence as soon as she stepped inside, a subtle weight in the air, a faint chill that brushed against her skin. She stood in the center of the room, her voice steady as she spoke, hoping that somehow Evelyn could hear her. "I know what happened to you, Evelyn. I'm so sorry for what you went through. I know you were afraid, and I know you didn't deserve to feel so alone." Her voice wavered, thick with emotion. She didn't expect a response, but speaking the words felt like an act of release, a way to reach across the barrier between them. For a moment, there was only silence. But then, a faint whisper brushed against her ear, a soft sigh that carried a sense of relief, of gratitude. Laura felt a warmth settle over her, a gentle, comforting presence that seemed to embrace her. She closed her eyes, letting the sensation wash over her, feeling a deep connection to Evelyn, a bond that transcended the physical world. Suddenly, a memory surfaced in Laura's mind, an image she couldn't have known. A young woman painting in the empty room, her face etched with concentration, a small smile playing on her lips. Laura could see the colors on her canvas, vibrant and alive, a reflection of the passion that had once filled Evelyn's heart. She realized then that Evelyn had loved this place once, had seen it as her sanctuary before it became her prison. That memory, brief and fragile, seemed to hold a piece of Evelyn's essence, a glimpse into the life she had lost. As the vision faded, Laura opened her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. She understood now what she had to do. She spent the rest of the night searching through her things, gathering paints, brushes, and a canvas, setting them up in the empty room. She knew it was a small gesture, but it felt like the right one. If Evelyn had been forced to abandon her art, her passion, then perhaps helping her finish what she had started might bring her peace. Laura painted late into the night, guided by a strange intuition that seemed to flow through her, as though Evelyn herself were guiding her hand. She lost track of time, lost in the colors and shapes, the strokes of the brush filling the canvas with a life and energy she hadn't felt in years. As she painted, she could feel Evelyn's presence growing stronger, filling the room with a warmth that chased away the shadows. When she finally finished, Laura stepped back, taking in the painting with a sense of awe. The colors were vibrant, alive, a reflection of something pure and beautiful. She felt a profound peace settle over her, a feeling that Evelyn was there beside her, watching, content. As dawn broke, a soft, final whisper filled the room, barely audible, but filled with a deep sense of gratitude. "Thank you." And with that, the presence faded, leaving the room bathed in the soft, golden light of morning. Laura knew then that Evelyn had found peace, that her spirit had been released from whatever torment had bound her to this place. The apartment felt different now, lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. Laura smiled, feeling a sense of closure she hadn't thought possible. But even as she left the room, she couldn't help but feel that a part of Evelyn's spirit would always remain there, not as a haunting presence, but as a gentle memory, a reminder of the life she had once cherished. After that night, the apartment was quieter than Laura had ever known it to be. The sense of dread that had once haunted every corner was gone, replaced by a profound stillness. The empty room no longer felt cold or oppressive. It was just a room, ordinary and unassuming. Yet it held a warmth now, as if Evelyn's spirit had left behind a piece of her peace, a gentle reminder of the life she had once lived and the solace she had finally found. Laura spent her days in a state of quiet reflection, feeling both relieved and slightly hollow. She had grown accustomed to the strange presence, the whispers, and the tapping. Now, the silence felt as if a friend had left, leaving her with memories and echoes of what they had shared. For the first time, Laura considered whether she would stay in the apartment. With Evelyn's spirit at peace, it felt like a different place, almost welcoming. But she couldn't ignore the haunting memories of what she had experienced. The sense of connection she felt with Evelyn had been powerful, life-changing, but it had also been terrifying. She decided to take one last walk through the apartment, wanting to say a quiet goodbye, to acknowledge the space that had held so much fear and, eventually, healing. As she moved from room to room, memories of the past few weeks resurfaced, each room carrying its own moments of dread and revelation. She paused at the door to the empty room, her hand resting on the cool wood. She opened it gently, stepping inside one final time. The room felt different now. The soft morning light filtered through the high window, casting a warm glow across the walls. Laura looked around, taking in the small details, the gentle scuffs on the floor, the faint patterns of dust, the faint smell of paint that lingered from her work the night before. She could almost see Evelyn here, painting in the early morning light, her spirit free from the torment she had endured. A smile touched Laura's lips, a quiet sense of gratitude filling her heart. She felt that Evelyn had left something behind, a warmth that seemed to fill the room, as if thanking Laura for her help. Laura took a deep breath, letting the warmth settle into her, and said, "Goodbye, Evelyn." She lingered a moment, feeling a calmness wash over her, a sense of closure that filled the empty room. She knew that Evelyn's spirit was at peace now, that whatever darkness had once filled this space was gone. And with that, she closed the door gently, leaving the room behind. Back in her living room, Laura sat in quiet contemplation, feeling the weight of the past weeks finally lift. She knew she could stay here, that the haunting had passed, but a part of her felt that it was time to move on. She had helped Evelyn find peace, and in doing so, had found a part of herself that she hadn't known was there, a courage, a sense of purpose, and an understanding of the importance of facing the past, of helping others, even when they are no longer there to ask for it. As the days passed, Laura found herself preparing to move. She packed her belongings with a newfound sense of calm, feeling that she was leaving not out of fear, but out of a desire for a fresh start. She left the apartment one final time, feeling the quiet blessing of Evelyn's spirit, the knowledge that they had both found peace in their own way. Outside, she looked back at the building, the place that had become a strange and powerful chapter in her life. She didn't see it as a place of horror anymore, but as a place of healing, of facing the unknown. With a final glance, Laura turned and walked away, leaving behind the memories of the empty room, carrying only the peace she had helped to create.